Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our campus weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook through a YouTube link. So as you may have noticed, we have two faces, hopefully both familiar at this point. So just to address kind of what's happening with Real Talk and where it's going to go for the rest of the semester. So as many of you probably know and recognize Sydney, she was previously a staff member at the Women's Center, is now a welcomed volunteer at the Women's Center as she has moved on to other things, but is still very much involved in this work. So since Real Talk really started because of our friendship and relationship as coworkers, we wanted to give Sydney a proper send-off for Real Talk. So she's going to be joining us throughout most of the rest of the episodes for the rest of the semester, and with other guest speakers and things like that. But obviously Holly is with us because she is in the role now and going to be a part of Real Talk as we move on. So it's really fun now having this all merge and kind of get together. So today we did not intentionally match, if you're wondering. But we wanted to talk about intersectionality, particularly because February is Black History Month and March is Women's History Month. And so a lot of identities being kind of addressed and recognized. And it's really important that we also recognize the history of the gender-based violence movement and how that came to be, and really was kind of on the backs of a lot of Black women, a lot of Black queer women, a lot of Black trans women who are fighting for rights for all, but particularly for those most oppressed in the marginalized communities. So I think to start, maybe just giving obviously credit to where credit is due to where intersectionality came from. So it was a term or a concept that was coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw, who is a lawyer, an activist, an advocate, a scholar. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, just doing such incredible work. And she coined this term actually a couple decades ago, right? It's not a new thing. I think people think it is, but it was a term that essentially helps, and I think particularly when she started talking about it, it was through the lens of particularly Black people and Black women about the kind of different systems of oppression and how they intersect, how they overlap, and how all the parts of our identities can't be separated out and are going to impact our lived experiences, particularly with trauma. And so I think when we talk about our issues, and we've talked about this a lot in previous episodes, how like different pieces of our identity impact trauma, but I think we haven't actually dug into what intersectionality means and looks like. So I'm really excited for us to get into it. So yeah, I think the first thing I thought of, especially kind of going back to the history of the anti-sexual violence movement, anti-gender-based violence movement, and honoring Black History Month in particular, is that when people, I think of the feminist movements, right, and fighting for equality or equity, we think about the white lens because that's what's in history and that's what's kind of being taught and that's what's kind of being showed, when in reality it was really Black women's voices who were kind of at the forefront of this. I think there's an issue in the fact that we don't know that as a society, and don't recognize it always, but also in recognizing the different ways that Black women experience, or Black queer women experience, or Asian women experience, or whatever identities people hold, are going to impact how they experience gender-based violence. So I thought that might be a good place to kind of start in addressing that.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've seen a bunch of stuff, I've seen a bunch of stuff on Instagram that says things like, if your feminism doesn't fight for Asian women, or if your feminism doesn't fight for queer women, it's not feminism. And I think that kind of connects a lot to what you're talking about now.
Yeah, exactly. Right, because you can't say, and there's even the term of trans exclusive radical feminism, I think is the R, that is used to identify feminists who say that they're feminists but don't include trans women,
Right.
and that's like, or trans people, and that's just not feminism. Like it doesn't work that way. You can't have equality for some but not equality for all.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's really interesting that when I started seeing that, I think I was like, wait, people do that? Like they're excluding under this umbrella, like obviously I know people are excluded all the time. Trans folks are excluded from things, but like under the feminist umbrella, when we're talking about intersectionality, I was like, that is so counterintuitive. I don't even understand.
Yeah, like how can you call yourself a feminist if you're or someone who cares about, people's equality and well-being if you're
Right.
not fighting for everyone? Yeah.
Yeah. And just like creating that feminist lens as like they portray it as like a catch-all category, but when it's not inclusive of like able-bodied or heterosexual, or like just having a catch-all category is not helpful if you're not going to include everybody.
Right.
Yeah, and recognizing that it's not going to look the same for everybody because of those identities. I was thinking about, I attended like a lot of trainings this past week for some reason. It was just a training week. And I think because of maybe Black History Month, a lot of it was focusing on particularly Black women, but really the lens for people of color and how they experience sexual violence in particular. And I remember in one of the trainings, there was a woman who shared her experience, a Black woman who was sharing her experience of rape and sexual violence, and was saying when she was growing up, she was taught, you are Black first and then a woman. And so it was like you have this responsibility almost as like a loyalty to your Blackness before your loyalty as a woman, which was shaming and silencing a lot of Black women from sharing and disclosing their sexual violence, particularly if the perpetrator was a Black man or another Black person or person of color. And I thought that was fascinating and really interesting. But I think that is true, particularly as a white person with a lot of privilege. I think we are considered the rule and everyone else is the exception, right? And it others people who are not in the whiteness, right, or portrayed as white. And I think of the way that we see people, and I think it's natural to kind of like categorize in your head when you're like looking at people. If you're in a crowd of people, not now because COVID, but like, people, you automatically are like putting people into little boxes. I think that's natural for our brains to do that, but that's part of the problem, because if you're looking at someone in a wheelchair, you're going to see them as a person with disability before you see them as women, before you see them as Asian, before you see them as, whatever. And that's part of the problem, because then we don't see them as a whole person. Or when people are like, I don't see color, and use that as like, whatever. But that's denying that person's lived experience. That's denying a huge part of that person's identity that they can't just take off. Like maybe you say you don't see color, but they can't not see their color. And we do see their color in our systems. Wait, I'm going to shut up, but yeah.
Well, I feel like that's just a very obvious sign of privilege. If you can start to break down other people's things that like you can classify them by. So, this is a Black woman and she's a lesbian. That right there is my own privilege because I'm a cisgendered white woman.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So just being able to like use my privilege in that way, I recognize that that's my privilege, which is helpful, but like there are a lot of people who don't. And I think that's like the first step in intersectionality is understanding, it's okay to have your privilege, but what are you going to do with it?
Right.
Right.
And I think too, like Cara, what you were saying before of like, if you see a person in a wheelchair, you're going to just notice that before you notice like that they're a woman and they're, whatever race they are. But the trick, I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, with intersectionality too is, and I think this is where you were going, but it's acknowledging all of those pieces, and they're all just as important as the next one, because that person can't take themselves out of the wheelchair. Like that is a part of what makes their lived experience theirs. And so just like their whiteness or their Blackness or whatever else it might be. And I think that's kind of what Kimberlé Crenshaw's whole thing is, right, with intersectionality, is let's value every single piece of this because it's what creates every single one of our lived experiences.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and when it comes to trauma, like if someone has experienced, I think about sexual violence first, but I think we can talk about domestic violence, of course, as well. But like for someone who's experienced a rape, we'll say, I think society's initial reaction would be like, report it, you know, because our lens is coming through typically the lens of white, right? Of saying like, oh, well, a white person wouldn't even think, maybe not think twice about the safety in accessing, you know, law enforcement or utilizing that as a resource. Or like even thinking about other parts of someone's identity, even regardless of, you know, race, but documentation status, if they're an immigrant, you know, reporting doesn't feel safe for them because they're fearing deportation or whatever that may look like. And so, you know, just the automatic like assumptions about the access to different resources is what you're kind of, I think, leaning towards too, Holly, about like privilege. It's like, we have to recognize our privilege if we have it in whatever ways we have it, whether it's, you know, able-bodied, cis, white, heterosexual, the list goes on and on,
Yeah.
you know, whatever, to recognize the ways that like it doesn't negate the trauma you experience. Like it doesn't mean like, oh, because you have privilege, your sexual assault or your abuse doesn't matter as much as someone else's. It's not at all saying that. It's just saying like, you're going to maybe have access to resources that others who are oppressed because of your privilege, right? Like it's not your fault that you have privilege. Like you didn't wake up and decide to be white. You didn't wake up and decide to be able-bodied, whatever, but you have it and you have to own that. And you have to know that it comes at the price of someone else, you know, not having that. Does that make sense?
No, it totally makes sense. And I think, I hope this isn't so like far out of the way, but just as you were saying that, like not negating your own trauma because you have these privileges, it made me think of male survivors. And when they experience a sexual assault, they're less likely to be believed if they go to the hospital for a forensic kit or to the police department or whatever. And like, that's not saying like, oh, women have this privilege, like that they're going to be believed, because we know that people, like just for survivors, like that's not always the case, but it happens to men too. And it's a less talked about thing. It's a less, you know, recognized thing. And then we've seen it in our work that there are male survivors who try to go to the hospital and they're not believed or they're brushed off because, oh no, you're a man and that doesn't happen to a man. And I think recognizing a male survivor's intersectionality in that perspective is important too.
Exactly. Especially if that man has other identities that are in marginalized communities or oppressed, right? If it's a Black man, if it's a queer man, right? If it's if the man was assaulted or abused by another man or by a woman, there's all these different ways that our society will look at that and judge it almost of like what's valid, what's not, which is so unfair and not how it should be.
And I think part of why we do the work that we do as advocates is to bring that to light.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The other piece I think that is important, so obviously it's Black History Month and we want to honor the folks of color who have really been at the forefront of it. But I think I'm so glad like that we've, you know, and Holly brought up like able-bodied, like there's so many other parts of our identities that I think we've, even in our real talk, have neglected to bring up sometimes, again, because of privilege. We just may not even consider those other parts of our identities, which I think is part of the conversation. And like why we're having this conversation today is not to like shame people and be like, if you're white, you don't have a right to talk about this. You know, like obviously we're talking about it because we want to bring light to these issues, but also being able to recognize like, as white women, you know, all here together talking about intersectionality, like we're missing voices, we're missing perspectives. So encouraging, I think, people to also do their own research. Like the trainings I went to this week were really eye-opening to me and like really helpful. And I'm going to continue to kind of do that work. And I really think it's an important part of the process of like understanding your privilege, but not just for the sake of understanding it, but understanding what it means for folks who don't have that privilege, and especially in our line of work.
Yeah. And I think educating ourselves is so important because it's our responsibility to understand what perspective we're missing.
Mhm.
So I feel like taking the time to learn on our own and then listen when those marginalized communities come forward and talk and tell us what they're experiencing. It's not our place to say, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, that's not
Right.
what I meant. It's like, well, that's how they felt. So that is what happened.
Yeah.
And like,
Yeah,
just like
taking it as
listening
truth.
and understanding that that is their perspective. And I can't say that's not their perspective because I'm not in their shoes. And
Right.
it's my responsibility to then go and learn about that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. Take what they're saying as truth, you know,
Mhm.
not minimizing it and saying, well, that wasn't my experience. Like, okay, good for you. But like,
Yeah.
if that was their experience, you know, like you have to honor that and make
Yeah.
space for it. And I think that's why the whole, like, I'm trying to think of what it was, either the false allegation thing or something that people were using as like a, oh, no, it was the Me Too movement, which also founded by a Black woman, Tarana Burke. But yeah, which people think the Me Too movement started with like the hashtag. It didn't. It started in 2007 by Tarana Burke, and was focusing again on Black women, particularly, or women of color, and Latinx women. Like, we can't forget, obviously, like, people of color doesn't just mean Black or African American. So, but yeah, a lot of people, when the Me Too movement was kind of resurfacing with the hashtag, I saw a lot on social media of people being like, um, you know, trying to deny it by saying, well, like, that didn't happen to me, so it couldn't be what, you know, couldn't be reality. And that was like the whole point of Me Too, was to say, no, I'm really glad it didn't happen to you, but it has happened to me, and that doesn't take away from my truth.
Right.
Yeah. And it's like when the Black Lives Matter came out and there were people that were like, well, all lives matter. And I'm like, you're missing the point here.
You're right.
We're not,
Smile.
just
Right.
look further underneath that surface.
Right.
Yeah.
I like
Exactly.
that you just said that, like, look further underneath that surface, because there's so many people who are so quick to say, well, that's not what would happen to me, or I would never be nervous, you know, to call the police for these other reasons, or whatever it may be. Like, great, I'm so happy for you, you know,
Yeah.
but you're
Yeah.
not, you don't speak for every single person in the whole wide world.
Your
Yeah.
experience doesn't speak for somebody else.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
And I think too, like this, there's so many other pieces of intersectionality. Kara, I'm thinking about the post that you made months and months ago with like the little like wheel of all the different parts of our intersectionality. Cause like things like education and, you know, documentation status and the language that we speak and our socioeconomic status, like all of these are facets of intersectionality, you know. And I know we've been talking about like gender and sexual orientation and race and things like that, but there's so many other layers to this too. And I remember when I did my training with the Women's Center, we did the intersectionality training, and there was like a ton of questions. There were different pieces of your identity, whether it was race, language, like gender, sexual orientation, like around the room. And then questions were asked about like what impacts this and what's part of your identity is the most important to you. And it was like the most empathy building thing I've ever experienced. It's the thing one of my biggest takeaways from learning to work at the Women's Center. Makes me so sad they don't fully do it anymore in like the virtual world, because it was so impactful to like step into this work and to like just start to create that shift that we've been talking about, of like, think about someone other than yourself when you kind of are listening to people's experiences, because in this work you're going to meet so many different people of so many different, like from so many different places, but also like honoring who you are too, and like, what did I learn about myself in that exercise, like what was important to me that maybe nobody had asked me to think about that before. So it was cool.
Yeah, like reflecting on your, like, and we've been talking about privilege and throwing that term around a lot, but yeah, just reflecting on your own lived experience, reflecting on your own walk of life, and honoring, right, that people are going to come from different walks of life. And I think that's maybe a great way to like start to wrap up the conversation, is what are the takeaways of intersectionality? Why is it important? And like, what do we want people to take away from not just this conversation, but any conversation about intersectionality, and why it's a necessary part of not just feminism, but equality and equity, and why we're fighting for, or what we're fighting for our clients and the people we work with. Because I think that's what you were just saying was a perfect like segue into like, because when you said empathy, that is what made me think of it, because I'm like, that's kind of the point, right? Like I think is the point is to have empathy for people, to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to be able to understand a different perspective, you know, one that is not the same as your own, to be able to honor it, even if you don't understand it, right? Just to try to understand it, to educate yourself so that you do understand it, because we can't just ignore people's identities.
It down and saying, no, that's not a thing, because it makes me feel uncomfortable to think about that.
Yeah, like I always think of Audre Lorde and like all the books that she wrote, and just talking about like the fact that she was Black, the fact that she was queer, and the fact that she was a woman. She was like, I can't ever separate those things out. And I feel like Roxane Gay like does a lot of those talks too and stuff. And so just like recognizing that it's not just the fact that our systems have created barriers for all of those different identities and the able, you know, we talked about the other identities as well, but the fact that because those barriers are in place because of the systems that are built that way, right, to privilege some and not others, that we have a responsibility to not just recognize it, but to change it, like change the systems, like address the root of the problem and not just the symptom of it. That makes sense.
I feel like intersectionality gives us almost like a roadmap to like undoing the systems of oppression, because it shows very clearly how the different lived experiences are affecting your outcome in society.
Yeah.
Because you just can't get away from it. And intersectionality just kind of brought light to the fact that this is something they didn't choose. This is something that is a part of that person, and you don't deserve to be oppressed because of your lived experiences.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's amazing. Yeah.
I agree. So any other takeaways, any other final like thoughts before we wrap up?
I think when I first learned about intersectionality was really in that training that I was talking about before. And we talk about it all the time. Like once you do this work, you can't turn it off. You know what I mean? Like when you're watching TV or when you're reading a book, like you see sexual violence or, you know, domestic violence, like it pops up, you see, you know, all of these different things. And it really was, I think, my first step into that was like learning about intersectionality, and that privilege is created in those spaces, oppression is created in those spaces, but that it is okay to honor the fact that it is who you are too. You know, like we talk all the time, and it's another conversation, we've had it before, about recognizing your privilege and then doing something with it too, but also like it, you know, there's just so many different pieces of it. And by recognizing the different pieces of who we are, it can help us build empathy for other people too, and say, well, just like that part matters to me, that matters to them. And that's awesome. And that's cool. And how can we work together to like create this, to create a better space? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like honoring your own lived experience allows you to honor someone else's better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it made me think too about like, I think some people who don't maybe understand feminism and what it looks like today, don't understand the anti-gender-based violence movement as it looks like today, or intersectionality, might have the defensive thought of like, that's divisive to look at people's identity, you know, like I just look at like kind of like what we were saying before, but the opposite of looking at someone as a whole person, but denying all the different parts of their identity by saying, I don't see color, or I don't see this, or whatever. And so I think that like that response indicates that we need to educate ourselves on what intersectionality actually looks like and means, that we're not actually creating division. The division's already there, right? Like the systems are already creating that division to prevent people from being able to access different resources safely or accessibly or whatever. And so I think like recognizing and understanding that it's not working to divide, it's actually working to provide equity, right? Like that it is the point of us discussing this is to be able to make sure that we are working to ensure that people of all identities and all intersecting identities can access all the same resources safely and comfortably, or in a way that is right for them, and not have to worry about their identities being a barrier because of the systems in place. That was my last thought.
That was a cool way to wrap it up. Watch Kimberlé Crenshaw's TED Talk. It's really good.
Yeah. Well, there's so many. Yes, absolutely. Watch Kimberlé Crenshaw's TED Talk. Roxane Gay does a really good one too. And there's a lot out there. There's so many books and resources to learn about intersectionality. And we are by no means like experts on it, but we obviously, as people in the anti-gender-based violence movement, care about talking about it, in addition to incorporating it into the work that we do. And as advocates, and it's important for everyone, I think, not just people in our line of work, but for everyone to do that. So yeah, cool. Well, I appreciate all of your thoughts on that as well. And for anyone who has thoughts, feedback, comments, questions, if you have a reaction to something that we shared today, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. As a reminder, all these episodes are recorded and released on our IGTV and our Facebook through YouTube links, so you can access them anytime. And we're always looking for feedback, so please let us know what you think, share it with your friends, and tune in for next week's episode. Thanks for listening.